everyone. My name's Sean O'Byrne. I work for the Readings Bookshop. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to talk to authors, and tonight I'm very lucky to talk to Gerald Murnane. He's the author of 14 books, all the way from Tamarisk Row, published in 1974, to Border Districts, published just last year. A lot of people in this room would have read Gerald's work and will know that to read Gerald Murnane's writing is to leave the ordinary land of fiction, of story, drama, plot, the so-called imagination, all that, even in very good literary fiction, after you read Gerald Murnane's book, starts to seem like a kind of busy, hopeful over-organisation that really gets nowhere near the strangeness of what our minds really mostly do. This thing that is with us all the time, but that we try not to see, the strange activity of our feeling mind, emotion mind, image-keeping mind, that's always making our associations and refusals and patterns, our private, changeable but not changeable colours. And in doing that, Gerald Murnane's writing gets to some of the deepest, strangest, most important things about what we are, what we can keep, what we can give, how much we don't want other people, how much they hurt us, how much we do want them, how much we have to want other people, what the world is, what the human world is. With extraordinary persistence and extraordinary skill, for more than 40 years, Gerald Murnane has been at work at that. So please, would you welcome here tonight, Gerald Murnane.
Thank you.
Gerald, I wanted to ask first about something that you talk about in the new introduction to Tamarisk Row, where you go back to the time where you were trying to write a more conventional fiction, and then you make what I think of as a leap, and you understand that you can find a different kind of ordering principle that you can make with a different kind of thing, a different amount.
I have your question well in mind, but I have something to say first. It's a sort of formula. It seems to work. Well, it works in one way, not in another. It endears me to the audience, but makes me seem foolish. And the formula goes like this. You people here tonight can count yourselves fortunate. As I said, this formula I've used about for the last 4 or 5 years. You people can count yourselves fortunate because this is going to be my last public appearance. There's another thing I have to say before I answer the question, or try to answer it. What Sean just said by way of summary of my collected works or complete works so far is so accurate's not quite the word. It's such a complete and compelling account, the sort of thing that I would have liked to say about my own work, that it makes me feel that, you know, it's all, he said it already. So what we're going to do, I guess, from here on is just to spell out in detail some of that brilliant summary, which I hadn't heard. I'm trying to be serious. I hadn't heard it from him before, and I'm just really impressed by it. What did he ask me? Well, what happened in the writing of Tamarisk Row? It wasn't quite... It annoys me, and I'm not annoyed now, but it annoys me at times when people think that I had a writing program right from the start, that I had in mind clearly a book about a father and a son, both of whom were interested in racing, that I had in mind that at some stage in my career I would write a book like The Plains. It was nothing like that at all. It was a kind of partly ordered chaos. It was very hard to write most of my books. There were crossings out and dozens, if not hundreds of pages put aside and abandoned forever. Tamarisk Row took 10 years to write, and a lot of that time, those 10 years, was spent worrying, and I've always been a worrier, worrying about how I should go about it. I knew I had images in my mind more than enough to supply me for the writing of a large book. But how I recorded or reported those images seemed to me a huge task, and I could not bring myself to write a conventional novel, what I'm what I use a term now that might annoy some people. I've begun using it. I may have even used it in a million windows. Film script fiction. I'm not deriding films or film scripts, although I have no interest in them. The idea of a film script fiction, I would have begun a film script tamarisk grow by simply describing a scene and the dialogue between two characters and perhaps the thoughts and feelings of one of the characters. But I couldn't do that because I think right from the beginning I had a notion, or more than a notion, that what we do when we read and write is immensely more complicated than people suppose. And I guess I could go on a lot on that subject, and it'll come up again this evening. But that basically was the beginning. That was the beginning of it all, of how I became the writer I became. I thought it would be almost an injustice or a perversion of the truth if I were to simply write a conventional novel when I knew myself right from my early childhood that the reading of books, I couldn't write books of course as a child, but the reading of books at that time to me was immensely more varied and complicated than most people ever supposed. I'll better pause and give you a go.
Well, that makes me think of two things. There's an example in border districts where you talk about a photograph of a biographer on the back of a book about George Gissing, the author George Gissing. I think I'm saying that right. And I was struck by that. It made me think of what you're able to include in a fiction that almost never gets into it. And I thought of all the times I would have looked at the photograph of an author on a book and what a sort of curious kind of time that is, all of the little refusals and coming towards and arguments that you would have with yourself, and all you're doing is just looking at the picture. And so much of what you do seems to be able to keep that in mind in a way that few other authors are able to do, to make that the subject.
They made a documentary film about me in 1989 called Words and Silk. It was an unusual film in that the director uncompromisingly had me sit in a situation similar to the one I'm in now, and I had to just speak to the camera about my views on writing, answering hypothetical questions of the sort that I'm answering tonight. And one of the things, I think it would have been the first time I'd used this expression in public, I used the expression true fiction. And I hastened on to say that true fiction was not a report of the truth as we usually use that expression. My expression true fiction meant, or true fiction for me meant a report of the contents of a mind, the mind being the author's mind. And I don't see it as a remarkable achievement to have written, I know very well, of course, the passage that Sean's referring to. I can't remember the author's name, she was a woman. It was certainly a biography of George Gissing. I don't see it as a remarkable achievement that I was able to write that passage. What I was able to do that others may not have even tried to do was to absolutely track down and follow in their wanderings and their divergencies and their turnings back on themselves, to follow the chains of imagery and the impulses of feeling that make up the thing which, for convenience, I call my mind. And when you get, after years of doing that sort of thing, it doesn't, it may seem strange to others, but it doesn't seem strange to me now that I've done it for most of my life. And let me just add that it has its hazards or traps, because around about the mid-1980s, I conceived, didn't really plan it. Well, conceived's a better word than plan. I conceived of a book called O Dem Golden Slippers, And I wouldn't know how many people who would have asked me at any time from, say, 1985 to about 1995, and, you know, how's that big book going? And they'd be talking about, because I do a lot of talking. I don't hang back from talking about my writing when it's in progress, because it helps me to get ideas flowing and get things moving. So these well-meaning people would have said, how's that big book going? And I knew in my heart that after a certain time it wasn't going anywhere. And I never know to this day. This should reassure you that, as I said earlier, I didn't have a fixed program. I'm not a master supremely in control of his material, nothing like that. Ode Golden Slippers got out of control, you might say, and I just no longer felt in control of it, and I never finished it. So there's another side to that matter.
And part of that, from working from Tamarisk Road to the plains to inland to what might have become Odem Golden Slippers, was something to do with not needing to make a report to anybody else, that sooner or later, you call it somewhere the image forest, that the life of making, the associations you could make got so good that in a way there was no point reporting it to anybody else.
I can't remember feeling exactly that way. I would have said that to myself at times, sometimes as sort of justification for what I was doing. I would have had to say it sometimes to myself as a sort of consolation for the lack of recognition. Now, don't get me wrong, there were always people who recognised me sufficiently to keep me going. I never lacked for supporters in that sense, but I did always feel that I should have got more recognition, and it's come over and above in these last few years, come to me over and above what I would have hoped for at any time of my life. But to get back to that, the idea of somebody, a fellow Australian author whom I won't name, read Tamarisk, well, I have named him in other places, so I'll name him tonight, Barry Oakley. Well, Barry and I have had a serious falling out. I don't mind saying that in public. And we don't talk or contact each other these days, but when we were friends, he was the only writer I knew in Australia, well, anywhere, and I gave it to him and I said, you don't have to read this. It was a huge manuscript, but he read parts of it and he was full of praise for parts of it, and he had much less than praise for other parts. And I never forget the expression he used of some of those other parts. He said, it's turning your back on the reader, which was an interesting expression, turning your back on the reader. And I never did it deliberately. If it happened that the reader felt shut out, well, I won't say I'd apologise to the reader, but I was sincere in every attempt. I never struck a pose. I was never didn't think I had to strike poses to attract readers, but there would have been times when, and perhaps Odem Golden Slippers was that sort of book, that maybe I instinctively realised that I had turned my back on the reader. There are mysteries in my career, the same as there are mysteries in your dealings with your occupation and your interests in the people you deal with. It surprises me even today that I was never able to finish Odem Golden Slippers when I've done so many other difficult things.
That reminds me of the fate of Landscape with Landscape. I didn't know this, and it's in the new preface to Landscape with Landscape but that book was pretty much killed in Australia by one review in the Bulletin, a publication which no longer exists. But I was surprised and shocked to hear that, because that book is so good and so strong. And there's a story in that book, I think, which is the most gets to the other side of this, which is the story I'm talking about is the Battle of Acosta Nu. And that story seems to me to be so extraordinarily about doubt as to whether you made your imagination too strong, whether you should come back towards other people.
It's a wonderful thing to be my sort of writer. Well, there are many wonderful things about being my sort of writer. One of them is that you can project, a word I don't often use, you can project parts of yourself, as it were, as if there was a giant lamp behind you, and parts of yourself were projected onto a screen, and you could view them there and walk around and think about them and imagine them being in different shapes and colours. And the character, he's a first-person narrator in the Battle of Acosta New. He's in a country, the country where he was born, but he's absolutely convinced that he belongs in another country. And I think that's an apt description for many people, certainly not just myself. You would understand, I think, a sensitive reader, that the thing I'm talking about, that you think, why doesn't everybody feel like this, or why doesn't everybody share these views? It's so obvious to me. And of course, the country, the story was. The other wonderful thing, and I think I'm wandering, but I don't think the audience will mind this, the two things that came together. One of my sons in 1977 became seriously ill, and in the Children's Hospital one evening, his heart stopped beating, and for 15 or 20 minutes he was under the care of doctors that ran up from, they pressed those bells and emergency signals, and for those during that time, I suppose that his heart was still not beating and would not beat again, which was an experience that sort of. And then of course they revived him, so I had the benefit of the experience without the tragedy that followed. And the other, this might sound very odd, but on Christmas Day 1966. My wife, we were just only been married a few months, my wife asked me what I'd like for, she knew I'd wanted a book for Christmas, and I told her that I wanted a book called A Peculiar People, The Australians in Paraguay, by a man, I pronounce his name as Souter, S-O-U-T-E-R. So I read that book. It was a cold, wet Christmas day, and I read the book, the whole of the book, on Christmas Day, and the effect on me of my learning about the descendants of the Australians, or the last of the Australians who stayed on in Paraguay and couldn't get home, was, this might sound almost sacrilegious, it was almost as powerful as the effect on me of watching these doctors try to start the heart of my son. So I combined the two things into the one piece of fiction, and I think I did it very successfully. And the two, the feeling when you're struck down by tragedy, and there will be many listening to me who have that happen to them, the feeling is that you're sort of singled out and separate, that other people would never understand the things that you've been through. And then I imagine that the people in Paraguay would have felt somewhat the same. So I can't even remember what your original question was, but at least I've given you an account of how that story came to be written. Somebody, I think it was one of the three men who were combined together to form Australia Press, who published The Plains and Landscape with Landscape. I showed them that what became Landscape with Landscape. When I first showed it to them, they said, or this man said, Bruce Gillespie, it's the most impressive piece of short fiction he'd ever read by an Australian writer. And Sean is correct that a reviewer in the Bulletin, I don't know whether I named him in my foreword, so I won't name him here, but he's still alive. I was walking down, he canned it. It was, and believe it or not, it was clear from what he wrote that the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry, that absurd sort of thing, there was something of that behind his he was a young writer trying to make his way in Sydney, and I think he saw me as some kind of rival to himself. But here's a funny story which is not of literary, doesn't have any literary merit, but I was walking down, one day I went to the Adelaide Festival, and I was walking down the street, and I don't go out of my way to mix with writers, but I don't go out of my way to avoid them. If I meet them, I meet them. If I don't, I don't. So in the distance I could see this man coming towards me, and I'd never met him before, but I recognised that he was David Malouf. And he had he was with two people, a man and a woman, and he saw me and we stopped, and he said, "How nice to meet you. We should have met before." And I shook his hand, and I was in a sort of welcoming, friendly sort of mood. And before he named the person on his right, who was a man, I shook the man's hand. And then he named the person, and it was the man that had written this review, who said to me, I can't remember even what the expression was on his face. He said, "I just find it amazing that you would shake my hand." Go ahead.
Well, let's talk about the pleasures that are wholly literary, which are the pleasures of making this other place, making a book like The Plains, making a book like Inland. I don't want to ask in a too simple way what it's for, but I suppose thinking about The Plains, it's so extraordinary that you were able to organise that book where so much of the usual social is just pushed out of it, and a world that is more to do with your associations and your images is able to continue in the way that it does. But also it's not just some fantasy of you getting to do what you want all the time. The thing that's so interesting and so skillful is it's full of doubt as well, that you go to another place, the land of the plainsmen, and yet there are jobs to do there, there are problems, there are times where the man who's amongst the plainsmen doesn't know what to do. That's the thing that's so extraordinary, I think. Anybody could make a fantasy where they dance up and down and everybody claps, but you're able to make another world in which the difficulties and the confusions of this world are taken into the next place and worked on there in a way?
Sometimes people give me more credit than I won't say deserve. Sometimes people credit me with more perception and more skill than I have. I've never concealed the fact, or never concealed the origins of The Plains. I wrote, after A Landscape with Landscape, I wrote a book called The Only Adam, and it was to have two parts to it, a fairly conventional narrative, or narrative will do. And then there was this other strand, or these other passages interspersed with the more normal passages, and those passages ended up... The book itself, The Only Adam, was rejected by two publishers, and one publisher who did accept it, I was so unsure of the merit of the whole book that I wouldn't accept his acceptance, and I rejected it myself. And I said, "I'll take it away and think about it," and then he lost interest in it, and so it didn't get published. But the section that became The Plains, it was meant as a kind of the way music has two. I'm not a musician, but there's a descant and in certain sorts of music, there's more than two parts. There's a huge number of parts that are in harmony, and one of the parts of this book was the section that became The Plains. So it was never meant as a novel, as a piece of work in itself. It was meant to underlie or lie between or overlie another strand of fiction. And I can't ever remember. The Plains became a book on its own, but the whole time I was writing it, I thought it was part of another book. That's really all I can say, because otherwise I'd be inventing a writing self that didn't exist. I wrote it for another purpose. But I know it's a work of, I know it's a great achievement, and I look at it now myself and almost smile to think that it was born the way it was. And this is just the way it goes. We don't know. Who knows how the creative mind arrives at its achievements? Every book of mine has had a different story, so to speak. The creation of it has had a different story. How lovely it would have been if I discovered it when I was writing Tamarisk Grove, the formula, and just followed it for the rest of my life. I could have, but nothing like that. The exact opposite.
But you've thought hard about what writing's for and whether or not you should do it, that stop from inland, then over into barley patch. And then when you come back in barley patch, you sort of appear in front of us and say, all right, I'm going to talk to you in front of you about whether this is worth doing.
All right, I'll give you the whole story. While I was writing Odem Golden, for the books came, well, Landscape with Landscape was third, Inland was fourth, was that right? No, wait a minute, we've skipped one. The Plains, Landscape with,
Lifetime on
Tamarisk
Clouds.
Grove, Landscape with Landscape, the Plains.
Lifetime on Clouds.
Yeah, Lifetime on Clouds 4, you're right. Inland 5, Velvet Water 6 and Emerald Blue 7. Right. While I was writing, still writing inland, I was starting to think of Odium Golden Slippers, and it took, as I told you already, many years to discover, many years to realise that I had to give it away. While I was writing Odium Golden Slippers, I found enough material at hand to have Velvet Waters published. I had a lot of things that I'd written for small magazines and a few things that I wrote. Well, I think I wrote the story Velvet Waters for the book Velvet Waters, and a similar thing happened with Emerald Blue. So I had those two books sort of kept me published or kept me in the public eye while I was still grappling with Odium Golden Slippers. And it was a big thing to have to face at the age of late 40s, that I'd started a book that I couldn't finish. And it set me thinking about what I was doing and whether I should keep doing it, whether I was meant to keep doing it, whether I was able to keep doing it. These big basic questions occurred to me quite a bit. And the other thing that followed from that was, well, if I do stop writing for publication, what do I do in its place? Because it was such a significant part of my life. And my interest in horse racing goes back to my childhood, and interest isn't even the word, it's an obsession, and I freely admit to that. My obsession with horse racing was always with me, and there were times when I begrudged the writing of fiction because it kept me away from my deep interest. It took time away took from me time that I could have indulged in my obsession. And if you read the race or horse racing book, Something for the Pain, you'll find a chapter there called They're Racing in the Antipodes. And that chapter reports a matter that I was always intended never to report, but I'm not sorry that I've reported it. I never thought I'd be sitting in front of an audience like this talking about something that I used to feel a bit of embarrassment about, as though it was a kind of childish or childhood activity. And I'm talking about the imaginary horse racing world of the Antipodes. Something that has to be mentioned here is my my archives. I have 3 archives. The chronological archive, which is fills 3/4 of my room. And that's my life story in letters and journals and just jottings, mainly letters. The second archive is the literary archive, which is all the manuscripts and crossings out and rewrites and galley proofs and whatever that went to the making of my books. The third archive is the Antipodean archive. It's a 2-drawer filing cabinet, about 3/4 full of the details of a parallel universe in which there lie 2 islands, or large islands, bigger than New Zealand, collectively called the Antipodes. And on those islands, a huge amount of horse racing takes place. Now, yes, you can smile, and your reaction is exactly what I would have expected in the years when I wouldn't talk about this. So you can go ahead and a ripple of laughter can go up and down the audience for all I care. In fact, somebody wrote to me after a racing journalist, a very respected racing journalist who's the author of several books about horse racing. And he wrote to me and said that of all the fascinating chapters in a fascinating book, the story of the Antipodean Archives was the one, or it's not a story, the account of the Antipodean Archives was what interested him most. And I sent him a lot of photocopies of pages from that archive. And I said, don't answer this, just keep it as a present or as a gift and ponder over it. So it isn't just a childish obsession or something that I carried over from childhood. Where am I going? Yes, in the writing, in the days when the abandoning of O.D.M. Golden Slippers became more and more likely, I decided, and it wasn't a willful, once-only decision, it was the result of a long investigation into my motives, my mental and emotional makeup, you might almost say, my character. I decided that, as I put it in another way, that I had crossed the landscape of fiction. I'd explored, let's just call it that, the landscape of fiction. I'd explored that sufficiently, and I had found on its further side another landscape, and that was the landscape of the Antipodes, of the imaginary horse racing world. And before I go on, I must remember to say that I found a lot of justification for this, or a lot of reassurance in in what I knew about the Bronte family, who maintained throughout their writing careers an imaginary, let's call it a parallel universe, which they called Gondal, Gondal. Many of you know about it. And so I thought, well, if it was good enough for the Brontes, I mean, for an old guy or middle-aged guy in Australia, there's no reason to think badly of what I'm doing. I'm just doing what the Brontes did, and then I'm talking a bit flippantly of it, but it was a very serious matter. I thought, this is a very strange thing to do. It's not horse. It wasn't. I didn't become obsessed with the things that happened at Flemington or Caulfield or Moonee Valley. I became obsessed with the things that happened nowhere, in a purely imaginary place. And I decided that the effort of keeping that archive going would be sufficient to sustain me in all the years when I was no longer writing fiction. Now,
and that changes, though. Something happens. You find that there's something that can only be done in literature, which is worth doing. That's what's so moving. And you report it to us. You're obliged to make a report.
Are you talking about the barley patch and the
and the books after?
Yeah.
You say explicitly, I don't quite understand this. Because I'd read fiction, I was under an obligation to make a report. The because I read fiction is interesting.
Yeah. We go back to the beginning, I guess, that there's a passage in, did you bring with you the copy of the that I was going to read from, The Million Windows?
I did not, but there'll be one up the back.
Well, I didn't.
We can get a hold of that.
I had a pretty chaotic day. There's a passage in A Million Windows which begins, her name was Torfrida. And as I recall it, and I'm not always good at recalling my books, because when I try to recall them, the same thing happens that happens when I read. Parallel texts or branching out texts appear to me, or the images from those texts. So what I'm hoping I'm recalling now is a passage in A Million Windows which begins, her name was Torfrida. When I read a book which wasn't really meant for children, but it became a children's book, Hereward the Wake, by Charles Kingsley. I had very little to read as a kid. I wasn't well provided with books, but I joined a library at one time and read Hereward the Wake. I fell in love with a character called Torfrida, but when I remained in love with her to this, I'm still in love with her. And when I went back and looked at Hereward the Wake, there was little justification in the text of that book for what I thought and felt about Torfrida. So I'd sort of invented her myself as a result of my reading, and this, I realised, has happened to me over and over again, and I firmly believe, or I won't say firmly, I believe it happens to many people. They think they've read a book, but they didn't. They read the text of the book plus some other things as well. And because I've got the sort of mind that I have, sometimes I think that the text that I read that wasn't there is more extensive and rich and full of meaning than the text that was there. And while I'm wandering around like this, I want to recommend to you, I could have said when invited to this event, tell the people who want to go, instead of listening to me, tell them to read A Million Windows and a story called Last Letter to a Niece, which is it's just stuck on at the end of A History of Books. Because just about all that I believe about writing and reading is in that book and that piece of writing. And now I have to say that I forgot where I started.
I'm going to say to the bookshop, if the bookshop has a copy of A Million Windows, would someone just bring that down here? Oh, there's someone has one right there. Go on, we'll come to you in a few moments.
I was going to read it.
Thank you. And while that comes towards us, I'm going to ask a question, which is, thank you. As you came back, when you came back, it really was a kind of second life. Like, the amount that you've been able to make since then has been extraordinary. And another lovely thing has happened as well, which is more readers seem to have been able to find you this time. That something has happened in the last maybe 4 or 5 years where we seem to be more able to listen to what you've been telling us for a while. It may have something to do with the way we are, the thought I had was that we spend ourselves or spill ourselves. We're getting rid of ourselves so quickly to each other with things like social media or just the way we are together in the city. And there seems to be a way in which the thing that you tell us, which is you've really got the chance to concentrate much more in a way that doesn't seem, that people won't necessarily tell you can, on your private landscape, on what yourself will do if it's just able to sit for a while. I wonder if you get a sense of that, that more readers have come to you in the last 5 years or so, if there's a different sort of attention that seems to be being paid now.
It's uncanny that there should be this number of people here, and I guess I could say that most of you are on my wavelength, to use that expression, and so few readers were in earlier years. It could be that I've become even more open, and I don't mean that there were sort of shameful things to hide. I don't mean that at all. More open and aware of my own writing processes. That my books, yes, they are. A Million Windows. Consider how frankly A Million Windows speaks about the process of writing and the complexity of writing compared to, say, Tamarisk Row, which, there's evidence in Tamarisk Row that I was aware of these things, but I didn't. I wrote a more or less unconventional text. So partly it could be me, and of course confidence. I've never lacked for confidence, but I have a lot more confidence now as my readership has increased, and the more flattering things and sympathetic things that have been written about me. There's something else I wouldn't dare to say, because it's not in my nature to make large sweeping statements, but I wouldn't dare to say about one group of readers, say you people tonight, that you are more skillful or more perceptive than a similar group 40, 30 years ago. But one thing that may be connected with this is that people of all ages, young people who weren't even born when Tamarisk Row was written, seem to find things in my books that, they find things that amaze me. And the very fact that they read them and enjoy them and understand them is a source of amazement to me. And what I'm trying to get at is that a word that I suppose I have to use it, timelessness, that I never had the time or the interest to write about what seemed very important matters at the time, say in social matters or political matters. For me, I never got past the essential questions of, what happens when we read, what happens when we write, why do we read, why do we write, what do we get from reading and writing, and where is it all heading? So if I continually asked those questions and wrote books as a result of my asking, maybe that eventually, this is a funny expression, maybe it eventually worked on people and they started to say, like we've got a man whose opinions I didn't value much at the time, and he's disappeared from the literary world. His name was Paul Carter. He was once the editor of the Age Monthly Review in the 80s. He was the first to write a flattering, he was first to write a sympathetic review of the Plains. Anyway, he said, and this might have been almost prophetic, he did say it because he broadcast it over the ABC one night. He said, Gerald Murnane's work is not just a different sort of writing, he said, but it requires a different sort of reader.
Yeah.
And they're all here tonight.
That's right. That's right. We got 200. So just not to ask in a too simple way, but before you read that, is it fair to ask, what would you want from your reader, or what do you think you can tell them? What kind of recognition do you think is possible? So much of the books is about, I don't think certain kinds of recognition that people look for all the time are possible, but it strikes me that one thing that does come through again and again is the hope that there is one other person that you can tell the most important thing to, the most important things that you have, in your head and your heart.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of a very serious omission. I should have told you right from the start what I usually remember to say in gatherings like this. That is that the person who, and I am not trying to be funny, but you probably will laugh anyway. The person that's sitting in front of you is not the person who wrote the books. Now, thank you for not laughing. The person, someone did. The person who wrote the books, I better be serious, the person who wrote the books, and I don't subscribe to any theory of the mind or any theory of personality, nothing like that. My idea of the mind is it's just it's infinite and incomprehensible. Not the mind, not just my mind. The person who wrote the books, I use the expression that Proust used, or the narrator of Proust used in La Recherche, le moi profond, or maybe he did, maybe it was in another book, le moi profond, the deep self. I have to be alone at my desk, and I can write anywhere, but the best situation is to be isolated, not to be thinking of people gathered with books in their hands for signing and stuff, thinking of one ideal reader who may be sympathetic enough to understand what I'm trying to say, and then I put the person that's just what everyday Gerald is sitting here. I called him the breathing author. I subscribe also to the theory of. I largely subscribe to the theory of narration that Wayne C. Booth devised in a wonderful book called The Rhetoric of Fiction. He was an American at the University of Chicago. The notion of the deep self and the theory of narration devised by Wayne C. Booth, they allow me to say that, in all seriousness, that I couldn't write, my everyday personality couldn't write the books that I've written. It's not. I'm not making. I hope I'm not sounding pretentious. It's just a natural thing, and this ideal reader. She gets a mention, I think, in this book, and it's always a she because I'm a he. The ideal reader doesn't know what she wants to know from me, and I don't know what I want to tell her. And that means that for 40 odd years I've been trying to tell it.
Go ahead from A Million Windows.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be a good time to read.
Yeah.
There's a slightly humorous thing connected with this. I clearly remember writing this book. It wasn't that long ago, and I was writing it in the little room that I occupy at the rear of my son's stone cottage in the little township of Garoke, which the people of nowadays think might become a place of literary pilgrimage. And might bring in a few tourist dollars. They're very supportive of me for that, even if they don't read my books. And anyway, it was a day. There's a mention of the weather in here, and I borrowed that. I wrote about the weather in the words that I used there, because when I looked out of the window, which doesn't show very much apart from a patch of sky and a bit of a wall and the tops of some trees, I looked out of the window while I was writing this sentence, and I needed a reference to weather, and it was a day of scattered clouds and sunlight. So I used that here. Well, I clearly remember the 20 minutes or whatever that I spent writing this sentence, and I got a bit moved by it, or carried away, as some would say, and I wrote in pencil in the margin, "This may be the best sentence I've ever written." And you need a bit of encouragement when you're writing. Anyway, over in Adelaide, I acquired a very good friend quite recently, and it was through his interest in my books, a man called Shannon Burns, who's written about me. He later got to read this book. I think he believes it's the best book I've ever written. I'll say it's probably the most dense and the richest book I've ever written, even including the plains. Anyway, he got to read this, and sometime later, he didn't text me or phone me immediately, of course. Sometime later, he said to me, "There's a sentence in that book," he said, "that when I read it, I wrote beside in the margin," he said, "This may be the best sentence that Gerald Murnane has ever written." And I had a feeling that would be that one. Now, you know, or you should know, that anyone can just jot down a series of clauses or phrases and call it a sentence. A sentence has to have a subject and a verb, and a compound sentence has more than one subject and verb, and the lesser, they're called clauses, the lesser clauses all fit in to make one grammatical unit. And I've seen writers praised, and Thomas Pynchon was one, seen writers praised for their wonderful long sentences, and I've looked through these passages. They're not sentences, they're just strings of phrases and clauses, and they fall away and they taper off at the end, but mine don't. Mine are grammatical units. And there's a piece I wrote, probably the last commissioned piece I'll ever write, for Meanjin a year or two back, in praise of the long sentence, and I really recommend you to read that. I put a lot of thought into that. Can't remember whether I wrote it before or after this book. Now, the problem with writing sentences of this length is that they can't be read in the one breath. So I'll just have to find the place where I take another breath. And also, the other thing about this sentence is not just, I'm not proud of it just because it's a grammatical wonder, or yes, it is. I mean, you won't find there's no one else in Australia anyway writes like this. But you knew that, or you wouldn't have come here tonight, would you? No. The other thing about it is that it's a summary of the theme. It summarises the book, and it uses, as it's the very last word in the sentence, is the word, probably the most important word in the book. It's closest to being the key word. The word that I had in mind over and over and over while I was writing it. The introduction was longer than the sentence. If, in the further reaches of some or another remote corridor, in an immense house of 2 or perhaps 3 stories, and behind some or another door that remains mostly closed, but in sight of a window overlooking some or another tract of far-reaching landscape, of mostly level grassy countryside, with low hills or a line of trees in the distance, a certain man at his desk on some or another day of sunshine with scattered clouds were to spurn the predictable words and phrases of the many writers of fiction who have reported of this or that male character that he once fell in love with this or that female character. And if that same man, after striving, as neither I, the author of this sentence, nor even the most discerning reader of the sentence, have or has striven, nor will ever strive, in late afternoon, and at about the time when the rays of the declining sun might have caused the pane in the window of his room to seem to a traveller on a distant road like a spot of golden oil, had found in his heart, or wherever such things are to be found, the words best fitted to suggest what he seemed to have felt long before on a certain hot afternoon in a distant inland city, and whether he had simply kept those words in mind or whether he had actually written them, either as notes for a work of fiction that he might one day write or as part of an actual work of fiction, then I do not doubt that the words would have been to the effect that a certain boy, a mere child, while he watched unobserved a certain girl, a mere child, whose name he did not know and who had almost certainly never had sight of him, wished for the means to inform her that he was worthy of trust.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Gerald Murnane.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.